All right, everyone, welcome to the Real Estate Game Changers Show. I'm your host, Mike McKay, based in the Jacksonville, Florida market. And each and every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern, we do this show with people who are changing the game of real estate all over the country. If anyone else is in the Jacksonville market or getting into it, feel free to reach out to us if you need help on anything, or we also still are a very active buyer in the Jacksonville market. Um, so this is a live show. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comments for our guest to answer. And this week we have Casey Smith from Atlas Transaction Coordinators. Casey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's kick it off with just something easy. If you want to share a little bit how you got started in the real estate business.
Yeah, so I actually got started kind of at the when the market was pretty good back in 2017, somewhere around there.
Mhm.
I had actually been in sales for a construction company in Dallas and did it pretty well and really enjoyed it, but then realized, like, why don't we just sell the whole house? Like we were doing windows and siding and like custom doors and things like that. So I kind of got an interest in it. I ended up getting licensed, but had joined a local RIA and kind of got obsessed with the creative side of things. I thought it was super fascinating what you could do, and they do not teach you that in realtor school. So right out of the gate, I was always interested in doing it, and my partner and I at the time had started doing wholesaling, the usual cold calling, all that fun stuff, but we were most successful by door knocking foreclosures.
Mm.
So I got really versed in how to handle those. And we did really well. We did probably did about 50 deals our first year
Whoa.
just by like white knuckling it, like handwriting letters and going door to door. So I had to learn how to stop foreclosures and I had to learn how to navigate the complexities of them right out of the gate, which is not always the easiest way to start. So
Mhm.
I actually, as investors who are probably a majority of the people watching this, you have to wear a lot of hats. You're doing marketing, you're trying to get your systems and processes in place, you're in sales, all of that fun stuff. And then you have to know the technicalities and the legality of actually buying and selling property. So I couldn't find a skilled transaction coordinator that understood what I wanted them to do. Most of the trained TCs come from realtors, and they're not really used to doing this sort of thing. So I had the idea to build Atlas TC services just for selfish reasons because I needed it, and I had a feeling that plenty of other people did too. So I ended up building an army of them. We're now a team of 10. And then we do transaction coordinating nationwide. I personally don't do that anymore. I still invest myself. I no longer wholesale, but I do buy rentals. And I'm still heavily involved on that side of things. So yeah, I kind of have the perspective of all angles, from the realtor, from the investor, from the actual admin side of things. So I'm an open book when it comes to finding your pathway in this type of industry.
So you, when you started and when you're doing those deals your first year, you were doing like a lot of creative financing on those foreclosures that you were purchasing?
No, actually, I didn't. I started out really basic. I
Mhm.
just did basic wholesales. If
Mhm.
the deal was really good, I would just team up with somebody to fix and flip. And that's how I learned how to fix and flip. So we would just split the deal. Leah is a very prominent fixer and flipper here in Dallas. And I would find the deal because we were heavy on the marketing, and then she would fix and flip it and just teach us along the way. So that's how I started learning that side of things. I
Mhm.
didn't really do anything super creative. We did take a lot of stuff sub two as an acquisition strategy
Mhm.
prior to it really becoming a huge, well-known thing with Pace Morby's groups and a few others that are making it pretty common.
Sure.
So sub two, I learned pretty quickly through some local RIAs, and then I would. I didn't. Man, I wish I kept more deals in that time. I think everyone says
Yeah.
that, but I didn't really have the confidence to do that because
Mhm.
it's really easy to start out in wholesaling and fix and flip when you partner for money, but to own rentals, if anybody does, you know that you have to have cash reserves. I mean,
Mhm.
there is an element there that you need. And so it took me a few years to get the confidence built up to that, but that mainly is what I prefer to do now, is just buy and hold.
Yeah. And you mentioned stopping foreclosures. So we actually had another guest on our show who's another client of your guys, I believe, Bryson Whitley, and he's in San Antonio, and that's really a big strategy of his is, foreclosures, and actually does door
Yeah.
knock a lot of them and then stopping them, right? So Can you talk a little bit? I know every state's different, but there's probably some Texas listeners on here. So if you could just talk a little bit about how does that work in Texas with stopping a foreclosure?
Ironically, the process isn't that much different anywhere because it's a lender-based process. You'd be surprised at there's not a lot of differentiation.
Oh,
So it really just depends on state rules of foreclosure. So how you notify, what your timeframes are. That's really the only major thing. If it's uh, I'm totally drawing a blank on the term, but if it's like a public thing, non-public,
mm,
but it's really a lender-based thing. So what that means is when a lender calls for closure, and lenders are nationwide, they're
mhm,
not necessarily always local. Some are, some aren't. But there's typically a process. What a lot of people don't realize is that most people can stop a foreclosure, or if as a owner, at least once in the life of the loan. And
mm,
so if you just request this, I follow the Wells Fargo model because I think it's the most complete. Wells Fargo typically requires that you fax in an actual fully executed purchase agreement, as well as a proof of funds and a what we call a letter of intent to sell, which is wet signed by your seller. And all that letter says is, I do intend to sell my house on this date per the attached contract. Here's my loan number. Here's the property address, meaning I'm not going to stop it and then continue to live in it and cause trouble for you. And so I like to include that no matter what lender it is, are those
mhm.
main things. And then you just need to follow up. We obviously typically have to fax in an authorization to speak on behalf of the seller, or you can get them on the phone. And do a three-way for them to give a verbal authorization if you're pressed for time. But that gives you the authority to call in, request all the things you need, whether it be a payoff or a reinstatement, just to know your numbers in time. And you can stop it. And it really only buys you about 30 days. So you definitely want to close in time and
Mhm.
not extend that out. But that is the main tool that works most of the time. Now, if it's a private lender, like from an owner finance, that's a whole different ballgame. Sometimes it's easier to stop it, and sometimes it's they won't even entertain that. So again, it's a case by case basis. But when we're talking about the major lenders, that usually is the case. This is typically why I don't advise when you're just starting out to get into foreclosures, against my own advice. And that's just because if you do go to stop a foreclosure and you're not able to actually do what you said you were going to do, whether that be dispositioning the deal or getting them out of the situation, they've lost their one chance to get back on their feet and get to a better position. But there's quite a few different ways you can stop a foreclosure. That's the easiest and the best way that I typically would follow, and it's worked most of the times. I think Aquin is the only lender that 100% never does it.
They're also
Out of all of the lenders.
the worst lender on the planet.
They're so tough. It's crazy. You get these third parties that sell these loans to these other people. So, getting really familiar, if you are going to do foreclosures, get familiar with the lenders. Get
Wow.
familiar with the sub trustee system, because what happens is a lot of people say, well, go directly to the sub trustee. And the sub trustee is going to tell you, well, it's up to the lender. So, you play this
Mm,
like chicken and mouse game, or I don't even know if that's a thing, chicken and mouse, cat and mouse, or whatever,
yeah.
where you're constantly like going back and forth. So, we go direct to lender, then we circle in the sub trustee so that everybody understands that we're trying to work towards this. And then typically they'll help assist with the follow up sometimes.
Yeah. So for the people who are maybe newer and listening, could you just explain what a sub trustee is?
Yeah, so when your property gets flagged for non-payment and goes into arrears, meaning you haven't paid for several months, the lender's going to put you on this list, and you're going to get assigned what we call a sub-trustee. And that's typically an attorney type that's going to monitor the foreclosure sale of your house with the county. So it's a third party, and this is why payoffs take so long to get when they're when they owe money, when they haven't paid for a few months. It's typically because there's an additional fees for this process. So by
Mm,
assigning the trustee, they charge these fees. And so what happens is when you order a payoff, when I advise people, yeah, some can get it to you quickly, but on average, you're looking at 10 to even 21 days to get
mm.
payoffs, because they have to go back and forth with the sub trustee to have them add their fees. And we've even seen
Ah,
situations where they come back and they're like, we forgot to add something, even though they gave us a valid payoff. And I've personally been in a situation where a lender's like, well, you didn't pay us enough. We forgot some fees. And I had to bring an attorney involved to basically
sure.
fight for me and say, this is what you gave us and this is what we did. So,
Yeah. Now that you say the wet signature thing, the Wells Fargo process, I actually, yeah, I have a very clear memory of you guys helped me with one because I'm a client of your guys, which everyone may or may not know. And I remember having to go to the guy's house at 9 o'clock at night, and get this wet signature on the form. Like, and it's just like a two-line thing saying, "I intend to sell the property, and here's the purchase
I
agreement."
know.
I remember
And,
that now.
and
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody requires it, but I think it's just a strong, why not give everything you can give to
Yeah.
help? And when I've seen so many people ask for it, it's just kind of an added, like, hey, we really do intend to do this. So if you want your best shot at this, I highly recommend you do.
Yeah. And you guys, on the transaction coordination side, we were talking a little bit offline, is you have insight into, I mean, I think, how many companies did you guys say that you guys are currently working with to do this for?
I mean, we've probably worked with well over 100 at this point. A lot of people fell out of the game during COVID. A lot of people did in this last market shift in Q4 of 2022. And so we've kind of filtered out some clients. We've seen some grow. We've seen some transfer in-house and whatnot. So well over 100 that we've at least vetted their processes on, consulted, or worked directly with in regards to handling every single transaction. And by transaction, just for sake of definition, is typically referred to as from contract to close. So that, we always talk about marketing and getting the contract signed and sales, and not a lot of people talk about what happens in the 30 to 40 days after that.
Yeah.
So Atlas really focuses on that time frame where you're really going through all of the timelines and contingencies of a contract. You're usually typically finding an end buyer or going through the process of vetting title for you to purchase, and a lot of landmines can happen in that time frame. So
Yeah.
that's typically what we work with.
Yeah. And you guys work with, like, obviously not just cash transactions, but creative, innovations, like every kind of thing, I guess, possible under the sun that's legal.
Yeah, I mean, well, I always joke like real estate is one of my favorite industries because it's never the same. I
Mm,
mean, you could have 50 sub two transactions and they'll all look different. It just completely depends on so many factors. That's our favorite thing, right? It depends
right.
when you ask a question in real estate. So yes, I targeted investors just because that's always been my wheelhouse, and I feel like they really didn't understand the importance of transaction coordinating or that somebody could do that job. So we are very versed in every type of deal you can imagine. Now, I have had clients surprise me sometimes where they're trying to do something really creative. I think the best one I've ever seen is I had a client once. There was like a property that was being owner financed that they were going for. And so the seller wanted out of the note. So they wanted to like take over and pay off that seller early, but keep the owner in the house. But he needed money to put repairs on the house. So they ended up
Mm,
like buying off the note and then paying this guy out, but also like refinancing the owner finance note. And I literally was staring at my system like, I don't even know what to call this. Like,
what is
so that
this?
was
Yeah.
probably like a creative one. But yes, novations, which novations aren't a new thing by any means.
Mm,
It's definitely been around for a while. I actually did quite a few of them in the Northeast. They're very common in the Northeast, which is strangely where
really?
a lot of our clients are. Yeah, it's because they have something called a transfer tax there, and it's quite expensive. It's just an
Uh,
additional fee for closing. So to get out or around those types of closing costs, innovation was it's a very common thing. So now it's just become a little bit more widespread. A lot more people are trying to understand how to do it as an additional strategy. But yeah, we do them all. Mobile homes, land, you name it. We've probably had our hands on it.
yep. Let's talk about that for a bit, because that's kind of been a hot topic recently, is novation. So I guess let's maybe start off, just for the people who are maybe newer listening. It like, what is innovation?
guys pay guys charge you like 10 grand for this info, so I'm going to give you this.
Exactly.
I'm going to give you like a golden nugget right now. Okay, it's not as complicated as you think it is. It is a more advanced strategy, but innovation is simply that you're replacing one contract with another. So to novate means to terminate one and put another agreement in place. And just for context, when you're assigning deals, you're only transferring your rights in a contract as a buyer, not your obligations. Meaning, if your end buyer falls out, you're still obligated under that contract to fulfill the terms. In innovation, you're transferring both your rights and your obligations to a new end buyer, which takes you completely out of that original deal. which raises the question, well, how do I get
Mm,
paid and what's the point? And that's where the legality of transacting it comes into place. There's additional paperwork, there's additional methods to getting paid that look a little different than most other deals. But in the simplest form, that's what it is.
right. And why would an investor go that strategy, or a seller maybe, why would they go that strategy versus just assigning it, or versus just a cash buy?
Yeah, the most common that I've seen, and keep in mind that there's a lot of questions you have to ask if you want to do this strategy. And that's simply, why do you want to do it? So that to rope into your question, I think the majority of my clients that do it successfully and do it well, it's typically because they have a house that's not in horrible shape, like not the worst we've ever seen, might need some repairs, but in order to get that top dollar for the seller and what they want, or maybe they don't have enough equity in the house, to make a lot of money off of it, you offer to do a novation. And all it is you're going to contract that deal, and you're going to try to market it to as many buyers as you can, but typically they're looking for a buyer that can get a loan. That means that your
Mm,
property has to be in a certain condition in order for it to be lent on. And so, what happens when you typically put a deal on the market? You negotiate repairs. There might be lender required repairs, or things like that. And so, you as the investor are typically the one taking that burden on without owning the property. And that
mm,
creates a whole like bubble of liability. And that's why certain paperwork is important for it. But that's the main reason I've seen people do it. I've also seen people do it without doing any kinds of repairs, but they're taking
mm.
over the process and not having the seller deal with any of it. So giving them the benefits of putting it on the market and getting top dollar without having to deal with the process or agents or anything like that. It's really the investor that's going to handle all of that.
Gotcha. Um, so I guess everyone does have a bit of a different approach to it. And I've heard of all these different ways that you can do it, right?
Yeah.
Some people are getting kind of attorney and fax signed. Other people are just having the seller sign the end purchase agreement. I mean, in your experience,
Yeah.
have you found a certain way that kind of works like the smoothest, or?
Yes, I'm a big fan of Brewer Method and Matt Vibreck's teams, and I'll just throw their names out there because they do training on this.
Mhm.
I work with a lot of their students, and I think that they're probably the best I've seen, only because I'm not a fan of using POAs.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, there's a huge, as a realtor in that perspective, there's a huge issue of fiduciary duty. And what I mean by that is if you're contracting with a seller and then getting a POA to sign things on their behalf, you're a principal in the transaction that's no longer looking after their interests. So
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of precedent has been set on this, but you know how real estate is. When people start to do things in mass, you get more eyes on the process and more legality comes into play. And I think that it's a matter of time before more regulation is put in place. So, with that being said, I don't like the POAs. And as I've mentioned to a lot of people, there's so many more layers of compliance and innovation. And what I mean by compliance is
Mm,
you've got state law, you've got title company and what they require. Then you've got, if you're going to be posting this on the MLS when you don't own the property as equitable interest, a
mhm,
lot of MLS boards do not allow you to post unless you have a valid listing agreement with the owner of record. My MLS board requires it. That means I
mm.
can't use a POA to list a property. They'll cite me and they'll put a violation on my license.
Okay.
So that means that the seller has to be involved with signing paperwork. So I don't like the POA just because it causes a lot of just gray area, and a lot of people might not accept it. And then there's broker law, right? Like, what does your broker require as the
Mhm.
agent who carries your insurance and is watching what you do and making sure you're not breaking any laws? So there's just a lot of hoops to jump through. I think I've seen also people file what we call a memorandum of contract. So they'll file that memo as the buyer, and then when they find an end buyer, they'll basically file a release for the fee and do it that way
Mm,
so that it
okay.
actually shows up on the seller side HUD. So transactionally, what's interesting about novations is your payment as the investor. In assignments, you typically see that on the buy side. In novations,
Mm,
you see your fees on the sell side. So you're actually seeing your fees line itemed on the seller HUD, not on the buyer HUD.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell how I've seen people do it. And then I also have seen people be completely transparent with
Yep.
their sellers and have them sign paperwork in full. And then they just put an indemnification agreement in before they sign with the end buyer that says, here's what you're going to pay me, here's what you're going to make. And so you pretty much almost are like a mechanic's lien on the
Hmm.
sell side of the HUD. And so that indemnification agreement is going to outline how much the seller's making, how much you're making,
Yep.
and where anything left over goes. And it also outlines the terms of what happens if your end buyer doesn't follow through, because then you're no longer in contract, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's almost like what happens as a safety net for that seller. And that all is going to vary from state to state. It's all going to vary on what you want to do as an investor. So I always tell people, I get asked all the time for paperwork, which I don't give out because number one, I don't want the liability, because what applies in Texas might not apply in Florida or might not apply in Pennsylvania. And so you need to really make sure that you understand how to protect yourself and what kind of terms you want to put in there and what kind of safeguards you want to give your seller in the event that your end buyer doesn't actually go through.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find that most of your clients, so they're having the seller sign the listing agreement then and the novation, or how do they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they do. As a realtor in DFW, I've been asked to do novations. That is something I do require. If
Okay.
you want me to do that, I'll say I'm going to need you to be transparent with your seller, which brings up another great point, because we're kind of reaching this era of real estate where you really can't keep things from sellers as well. I think the competition and the people that do really well, especially in this changing market, are the ones that are super upfront with their sellers. Be like,
Yeah.
hey, if you don't want to take my offer this low, here's another option for you, but here's what it's going to require and here's what the process looks like. And I think that's the biggest gap right now for opportunity, because a lot of people fell out of the game when the market stopped and interest rates went out a lot, which means there's a lot of opportunity out there. I've seen the market significantly pick up in the last few weeks.
Hmm.
And we're back to 5+ files a day of our clients
Yeah.
coming in, which means that everyone's kind of getting used to what's going on, and we're still trying to look for deals. So I think the ones that are really bringing it in are the ones that are like, hey, this is what we do, this is what it looks like, we're not trying to hide anything. We aren't going to buy your property, but we are going to help you find someone that will, and we're going to try
Yeah.
and get you the best dollar that we can get. Now, that's where these programs that are out there are going to be beneficial to you investors, because they're going to teach you how to sell the idea to your seller and make sure that they understand. Because when it gets into the hands of a transaction coordinator, their job is not to explain it to your seller.
No.
Their job is to execute the expectation that you set for your seller.
Hmm.
And so we've had a lot of situations where when our clients don't understand the transaction that they're selling,
Yep.
to the seller. And like, for a perfect example is a subject to. In a subject to transaction, you're taking over a loan and it's remaining in the name of the seller. It's an acquisition strategy.
Yep.
But we've had sellers be like, "What do you mean? I was told they're assuming my loan," meaning they really think that
Yeah.
it's being transferred into the name of the buyer. And we say, "Well, no, I think maybe you misunderstood." And then they'll send us screenshots of text messages from the acquisitions guy that
Oh.
specifically says, well, we're going to assume the loan. And so terminology is super important, transparency, setting the right expectation. And so as an investor, yes, you have to know sales. You also have to have some knowledge of the transactional process so that you can not have you can avoid having deals fall through for these reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. We've done a couple novations with you guys, and we've always just told the seller, "Hey, this is my cash price." They're like, "Oh, we can't do it." Well, here's what we have, but here's, it's
Yeah.
going to take some extra, work, right, or extra
My
pain.
opinion is
Payment,
this,
really.
like, your job is to be good at what you do. And so I get complaints sometimes that, like, I've had to kind of let go of some clients as a realtor just because I told them this is how we do it and I need you to be
Oh,
transparent.
yeah,
And they're like, well, they really don't want to. And I can't really figure out why. And to me, it's just a lack of skill. If
yeah,
if you're really good at your craft, then you can explain this in a way that makes sense to them as an option. Sell it
yeah,
to them. When I did foreclosures, of course I wanted to buy the property cash. I don't want to list it. Sometimes I would though. And sometimes I would do the takeaway and be like, I really don't want to deal with this. And they'd be like, can you just buy it? And then I get them to come to my price instead of going through that process.
Yeah.
So, whatever your job is to navigate them to what you really want
Hmm.
in a way where they think it's their idea. So I just think that that's something that investors need to get better at.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not innovation is not a strategy to put a square peg in a round hole, right? It's like it's a solution to something, right? It has to be a
It
solution.
is. And I always tell people when they want to, I get phone calls and they're like, "Oh, I hear you know how to do novations." I was like, "Okay, what market are you in and why do you want to do them?" And
Hmm.
these are people who have never even done assignments or at least never found consistency there. And like, "Well,
Yeah.
I just heard you can make so much more money." And I was just like, "Well, red flag." It's like you can make money anywhere. It's like, are you really looking and underwriting your deal the right way? Are you understanding
Yeah.
their pain point? Are you understanding what problem they need to solve? And are you really versed enough in all the strategies to put the best one and apply the best one to this person? I
Yeah.
just it disheartens me sometimes when I see people do that. And I'm like, why wouldn't you just do it this way? And they kind of look at me and they're like, you're right. I should have done it that way.
Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
take your time in understanding these guys. It's not just a quick fix to make more money.
Right. Um, so you mentioned in there too, like subject to deals. We've had a lot of people on the show who do subject to deals, but no one has talked about like, they talk about how they find the deal, how they talk to the seller, but no one has talked about like, okay, like how does this thing actually work? Like once you get the
Yeah.
contract, how do you get it across the finish line? Like what mechanics need to happen? Could you share a little bit about how you guys approach that?
Yeah, I will start by saying sub two is an acquisition strategy. It is not a disposition or an exit strategy, just for clarity. And a lot of people get very confused about that. And I was talking with a colleague the other day about this exact thing. And we were saying that, like, in order to, like, you need to know your exit before you understand your acquisition.
Hmm.
Like that's all going to come into play here. So with that being said, with subject to transition or subject to transactions, um, the most important mechanics of these deals is that you have control over the loan.
Hmm.
I have had investors assign subject to end buyers who have no clue what they're doing, and it's very alarming. And I've had them buyers call me later and be like, I can't get insurance on this property. And I was like, whoa, you should have been doing that prior to. So with that being said, with the subject to, there's a couple of things. We have like a checklist of sub two that when we get a property in our hands, we initiate this checklist, and we're gonna ask for a few extra things. We typically like to get a reinstatement and a payoff. You don't need a payoff, but I always like to get one because I want to see exactly what the numbers are. I want to know
Hmm.
what your interest is, what any back payments you have. If you've ever done a loan mod, sometimes there's an attached 20 grand or 25 grand on the backside through like
Hmm.
Novad or a secondary, loan that the seller might not have told you about. So I like to get both of those things, and I like to get the reinstatement in the event. Well, I'm going to have to reinstate it obviously to keep the loan current. So that way I know exactly what my fees are. I'm going to ask for a copy of the mortgage statement. I'm going to get a third party authorization, and that just is a document that gives me authorization to talk to the lender on behalf of the um, seller.
Hmm.
And this is super important. Get online logins to the lender. If you have
Hmm.
a seller that doesn't have one, make one. Get the last four of their social security number, which you can get on the loan authorization form. You're going to ask for the last four anyway, because those are the questions that they're going to ask you in order to get access to their information. So get online access. I just purchased a sub two property a couple weeks ago, and it was an elderly lady, and she didn't have a login, so it was super easy. Her son gave me the last four. I created the login, so then I could just go in, and then you're going to want to change the mailing addresses. You're going to have to replace insurance.
Hmm.
Especially if it's paid through the lender. So you're going to have to go through an insurance agency that's going to understand sub two loans and understand how to write the new policy with
Hmm.
the seller as additionally insured, and they're going to assist you with replacing that policy. That's the number one reason these loans get flagged for due on sale, is typically because the insurance was done incorrectly. So those are the main things that you're going to do up front, just to make sure you have all the data and you know exactly what numbers that you're looking at and you have control. I also typically get a POA signed at closing with the seller, because what happens is a lot of times they have escrow accounts with their lender. And so if there's any escrow audits or refunds of those accounts that technically are yours because you're taking over the loan and you already paid them off, that check is actually going to go to the seller if you didn't change the address or get
Yeah.
information. So you want to make sure you get a POA signed at closing. So make sure you're closing with an attorney or title that understands how to write these documents, because it does require very special protocol, and laws are changing all the time
Mm.
in all different markets. So you want to make sure that you're working with somebody who can put the right disclosures in place so that you don't have to deal with that down the road. Um, I know a lot of title companies aren't touching sub twos right now. They're kind of taking them back. Some things changed in Texas recently. Don't ask me to quote property code because I won't, but some things have changed to make sure you're doing things right. And so if you are going to do the strategy, just make sure you're on top of what property code is, what title and attorneys will do and not do, and then just make sure you have the checklist of all of those pieces so that you maintain control. You don't want to
Yeah.
lose control of that loan because they could call it due on sale. Now, that's a whole nother conversation after post closing,
Yeah.
is how do you protect yourself there. There's a lot of different ways to cure it if they do call it on, they do call the loan due, but it's pretty rare. Most lenders just want to get paid.
Yeah.
So if you follow those steps on the transactional piece, you're set up for success and usually won't have many issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And you guys like one thing I think is interesting is you guys track because you have different clients in different markets, you kind of track trends and
Yeah.
across the market shift. So what have you guys seen in terms of like the types of transactions that people are doing versus what they were doing, call it a year ago?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. It's about 60% of our clients, or 60% of the deals that fall into our hands are assignments. The rest of them are a mix of things. In
Mm.
the last month, novations have shot up. We actually don't do a ton of owner finance wraps anymore. Those were super popular in
Huh.
2020 and things, but I haven't seen a ton of them come through. And I don't do them myself, although I've transacted a ton of them, hundreds of them. I don't see a lot of people doing them. Maybe it's a tax strategy, maybe not. Most of my clients have a big tool belt, so they really do a variety. Nobody's really married to one type of strategy. So novations are increasing significantly. I'm also seeing a lot more people go back to assignments, which is
Mm.
not something that I expected. And that's because purchasing to fix and flip has become a very difficult margin, just with the cost of things going up and inflation, to take it down and to actually fix and flip it and put it back on the market with the unpredictability of what we saw. I'm talking, I don't know how your market was, but Dallas and Texas, it was a hard stop. I'm talking,
Yeah.
we went from like multiple showings and offers and bid wars to absolutely nothing overnight. It makes no
Mm.
sense. I had posted a property prior to Christmas, which is already a slow real estate season. But it was a great property, downtown McKinney area, which was a very favorable place. And we got zero showings. I mean, it was wild. And we tried reducing, and I was like, you know what? I really don't want to commoditize the price right now because I don't think that's the problem. I think it's just a
Mm.
mindset problem of buyers and people kind of adjusting to not knowing what's happening. And so, no joke, we ended up doing a couple extra renovations to it because we went to see the property and we said, hey, we really want to maximize. We did a little bit of remodeling, put it back on the market yesterday. I already have 3 offers. It's
Yeah.
wild at like, way higher on the price. So with that being said, I think that people don't want to hold anymore. A lot of people got stuck with holding properties when the market shifted. So I don't see a lot of fix and flip happening like I used to.
Mm.
And I think people are just going back into not wanting to get stuck with the costs of having to hold things in the event that they can't offload things.
Yeah.
So people are kind of reorienting their risk for the most part. That's why they like novations, because they don't have to close on the property. So any strategy where you don't have to actually close on the property, I'm seeing go up.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Hmm.
And then another thing we were talking a little bit offline before is obviously there's different approaches to transaction coordination. There's some people who decide they want to bring it in-house. There's some people who decide to outsource it. There's people who don't do anything until it becomes a problem, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the different ways that people approach the transaction process?
So I think it comes down to how do you want to run your business? How do you value your time is really the question you have to ask. And what is the complexity of what you're doing? So with those things combined, you're going to have certain people who, our model is we're a third party that can be a complete department. So when we think about as an investor,
Hmm.
if you're actually building a business and what I call an REI business, that means that you're going to have departments. You're going to have your acquisition, you're going to have marketing actually first, marketing and lead management, acquisition, transaction coordinating, disposition are your main operational pieces. Yeah, you've got finance and all that other fun stuff. But if you're just starting out, you are in every single one of those seats. And that means that you have to ask yourself, what am I good at? And what do I really want to spend my time doing? A majority of the people that get into this, let's be honest, we're all visionary types that typically are not operational people. We like to, we're in sales, we're go getters, we're really quick to do things. And that's what we do. So then you come to the transactional piece, and then you all of a sudden have to switch your brain to being a
Yeah.
detail oriented person who has to solve a lot of problems. Sometimes you have to turn into a private investigator trying to figure out who's on title and what this issue is and what do I need to do to clear it. And that can be a lot of strain and can be very overwhelming. It was for me anyway. And so your only option is, do I find somebody who's really skilled in doing this and just outsource it to them and create a process for that, much like people hire virtual assistants to do similar things?
Hmm.
Or am I going to find somebody with a skill set, hire them, and train them myself? And we all know that, like, if you don't know what you don't know, how are you going to train them? Do you have systems and processes in place for them to follow, or are you asking them to create them? Then we
Hmm.
go down this rabbit hole of, well, what kind of personality or profile needs to be that person? Do I even know what that is or what that looks like?
Yeah.
Right? So now you've got your business owner hat on and you have to make these decisions cost wise and time wise. So it's really good to outsource for people who don't want anything to do with it. This is a highly skilled position. Despite what people think about it, this isn't an admin role. This isn't, hey, do these things, because you have to influence a lot of parties. 3 to
Hmm.
15 parties on average can be in a transaction, and a lot of problems are happening. That's why we make money. So you need to have somebody that's influential and has a strong communication skill. You
Hmm.
also have to have someone that understands, oh, when I see a child support lien on title, no problem. We can get that cleared in 2 seconds. That's not a problem. Let's move forward.
Hmm.
Versus someone says, oh, there's this lien. I don't know what to do. Or does somebody know that when they see an IRS lien, they can look at the date and see if it's expired?
Hmm.
Like underwriters don't always catch this. And so you need someone skilled that can step up and say, actually, I'm going to challenge the underwriters to issue policy because this isn't relevant, or whatever the situation is. So kind of going back in summary, I really think it just depends on where you're at and what you know, and what you like to do. I have seen very successful people keep this in house. I've also seen a lot of people grow and then it became too much of a headache managing. So if you don't like managing people or you don't have a manager in place to do so, that's another cost to your business,
Yeah.
right? So outsource it. I think that it's not always just a person that you need. You do obviously need a person to do the work, but you also need somebody that can manage the department, just like you
Yeah.
would an acquisitions manager or a dispositions manager. And that means somebody who is saying, are we being as efficient as possible? Do we have our processes documented? Are we tracking important key performance indicators that help us understand how long it really does take us to close? Like what we call a cash conversion cycle in business.
Hmm.
But from the day it's signed to the day it's closed is your cash conversion. Really, how long does it take you to get the money?
Hmm.
And so do you have someone in place that can manage that process and make it as efficient as possible to help your revenue? All of these things are huge business decisions. And then we've got people who are not wanting to build a big business. They just want to do these deals themselves. I'm one of those people. I don't have a big, I just buy properties myself. And my partner helps property manage them. So I don't have a huge organization to do this. I actually use my own company. They transact all my deals.
I would
I
hope
do. I
so.
use my own service. Um, And yeah, you'd hope so, right? I always joke. I said anyone that gets trained on my team has to do at least one of my deals because they're going to feel the wrath of a real investor.
Right,
Because then
right,
they're
yeah,
not,
and you know how it's
I
done, yeah,
always, I always joke. I'm like, I am you. Like, I know
yeah,
your pain. That's why I built this service. And so,
yeah,
and my team are the people that we need as compliments because,
yeah,
we're the visionary. Go, 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 go. Once in a while, I get clients that are more operational minded. I would say you're one of them. Like, you
yeah,
definitely are one of the very few that really like to know the details. The rest of them are like, Casey, don't tell me anything other than whether it's closing or not. Like, they don't want to know anything. So it completely depends on who
yeah,
you are.
yeah,
I've had clients where it really didn't work out because they just wanted to yell over their shoulder and saying, hey, what's the update on this? They
right,
didn't want to have to go through a system. So again, it's a personal preference, how you see your time and your money. And then when it comes to who you hire, whether you use a virtual assistant or use someone in house, ironically, the number one question I get when people talk to me about using my service is, are your TCs overseas? Um,
mm,
and I say, actually, no. All of my lead transaction coordinators are stateside.
mm,
They are here in the US. They're very versed. English is their first language. They're very versed in real estate and property code and things like that. That's how I train them. But we do have VAs on our team to assist them because it's very difficult to find. An investor transaction coordinator really has to have those two qualities of communication as well as detail, and that's really hard to find in a
yeah,
person. So what we do is we create teams where you've got all those elements on a team and everyone's got their lane, but you've got one main person to communicate with. So
yeah,
we're realizing that's the most efficient way to do it. I cannot tell you how many times people have tried using virtual assistants. And by the way, as a disclaimer, my virtual assistants are some of the most skilled human beings I've ever met in my life. I have one of them that's worked with me for 5 years. I
mm,
have yet to see her make a mistake. No
same,
joke. I don't even exaggerate. She's like a freak of nature.
yeah,
And by the way, my VAs handle all contracts. They know how to read contracts. They know exactly what contingency timelines are. They know how to email, they know how to respond, but they just don't like being on the phone. And
yeah,
so it's really easy to hire that skill set. They follow our processes, they have certain checklist items they're responsible for in a transaction, and it works for them. But when it comes to, hey, this issue came up on title, can your virtual assistant get on the phone with the seller and explain to them why they have back taxes owed? Can they
mm,
explain what, or ask the right question to figure out why this other person's on title and who they are, or why their property's in a trust and there's a beneficiary on here that they don't know. All of these things happen all the time. And so I just ask anyone out there, if you want to hire a virtual assistant, great. Take a little bit off of your plate. They're super helpful and they're fantastic, and you can train them in a variety of things. But if you really want someone skilled in this piece to actually give you time and you want to build trust with someone on your team, I would just ask if they're capable of doing that. And there are plenty out there that are. But again, how much do you want to train?
yeah. It's interesting, right? It's like transaction coordination is like you almost need someone who's a little bit of a salesperson, right? Because they gotta
Yes.
sell the seller on like, whoa, I got this HUD, and I mean, sometimes it has to kick back to the acquisition route. I mean, there are situations
Yeah.
where stuff has to happen like that, but they're like,
Hmm.
what are these line items? Why am I paying back taxes? Well, you didn't pay your taxes in 5 years. That's why, but
Yeah,
you
you
can't
nailed
exactly
it.
say that. Like, you know,
So yeah, social profiles. I use predictive index to hire.
okay, yeah,
Social profiles are my best TCs. They're not
mm,
operational or detailed. They're social profiles, and those are sales profiles.
yeah,
And so, but it's a unique type, and it is one that typically can do both. But lean on that. So yeah, they have to be able to synthesize information very quickly and effectively, and understand the context of it to be able to have that conversation. We've actually had sellers tell us that they refuse to speak to our clients, the ones they contracted with, their acquisitions, and that they'll only close this deal if we talk to them. Like, all the time it happens. So I'm a big
yeah,
fan of saying, like, a good TC is going to build rapport with your people. And think
hmm,
about all the vendors you always work with, lenders or insurance companies or title companies. You want to have someone in that place that doesn't annoy the crap out of them.
yeah,
I'm in this TC group on Facebook that I love to hear their conversations because I like to see what they struggle with, how they process things. And one of
mm,
them was like, I just had a lender block my number. The transaction coordinator doesn't have access to the lender. That's
yeah.
a red flag, and that is
It's a
not a good
problem.
sign.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you want to make sure that you've got someone there that can work for you, that people trust and want to work with, and they're like, "Oh, if you're working with this TC, I know they're going to make my job easier, so I'd love
Yeah.
to do business with you." That's an aspect I don't think people think about.
Yeah, and I think it's an aspect too that just you got, giving the weekly update to someone, right? I mean, I know when I started working with you guys, I think I had 10 transactions or something at the pipeline, or 8 or 10, and I was like, I just can't bring myself to care enough to call everyone every week. I just like I just want to get the next deal, right? But I know that if I don't do this, then I'm going
Yeah,
to lose previous deals, but I just can't bring myself to do it. Like it
it's
just
a lot.
yeah.
It's a lot. I mean, most of my coordinators can handle about 60 to 80 transactions at a time. But that's because they have the team, right? They can delegate out really well.
Mhm.
So we train them how to delegate and manage the workflow, which is a huge benefit. Almost every single other in house TC I've seen that operates alone can handle maybe like 20. They might
Yeah.
cap out at 30. And what we also see happening, which I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute, as an
Okay.
investor, if you're going to increase your acquisitions team and increase your marketing to fill your pipeline, because we all know you have to fill your pipeline because not everything's going to close. I mean, and there's a
Mhm.
rolling average, right? So it's a pipeline thing to get consistency, which is the number one problem most investors have is consistency. You know,
Mhm.
you're starving one month and you're like crushing it the next, and it's just a roller coaster of things. Well, if you're increasing that side of things and you still only have one person handling transaction coordinating, have you thought through like the workload that takes? Because
Yeah.
when you think, what I know for a fact that I'm going to close about 35% a month of what I hold active. I know
Mhm.
every week I'm closing around 8% of what I hold active. I
Mhm.
know that, I'm going to have, well, our termination rates are fairly low just because of the way we process people. But, I know that my termination rates are going to be under 10%, in
Mhm.
general. And so knowing those things, when you look at your numbers, I always ask people two questions. How many are in your pipeline, and what are you closing a month? And if anybody tells me that what's in their pipeline is the same as what they're closing, I know you're not that experienced
Yeah, it's not
because
possible.
that's just not the
Like
case.
yeah. Stuff
It's
gets
so
delayed
true. And
in
so
probate.
we've consulted a few teams that are pretty big, and we're
Mhm.
talking like 100 to 150 transactions in their pipeline. So we've
Whoa.
done some private consultation for them on their teams because they can't figure out the TC piece and the workflow. They're like, our TCs are burning out, they're quitting. Can you imagine if you had 150 files and your TC just got burned out and decided not to work anymore? I
Yeah.
mean, I would pee myself. Like, I don't
Yeah.
even know what I would do. So, I mean, that's a liability, right, to your operation. So, I just want to put out there that you have to think about these things. What are the capacity loads of the transaction coordinator? And how much are you paying them to close, and is it worth it? Because if they'll just stack them to save money. And we see them calling me and they're like, Casey, I don't know what to do. My management doesn't think I need to hire anyone new. They're like, I can't keep up with this. And they're even saying, well, now we're doing novations, which takes 60 to 90 days to close on
Mhm.
average, by the way.
Yeah.
Our average close rate for most deals is about 30, but those are 60 to 90 from what we've seen across the board. And it's a complete brain switch. So, you have to have different things that you remember. I mean, we have process maps for all transaction types. I think I have like 50 plus transaction maps for all different things
Yeah.
because there's some things follow a pattern and then there's always the nuances and anomalies. And so if you don't have that processed out, it's going to be really hard for your team to remember everything,
Mhm.
and to not leave you open for liability when you do close on these more creative sides of things. So,
Yeah.
my advice out there is just make sure you understand the process or hire somebody that's already skilled and expert in it so that they can actually start documenting those processes to start safeguarding that piece of your operation. I've never understood why people don't um, treat it more seriously because
Right. Yeah.
I mean, when I've got I cried my first time. I had 5 foreclosures in my pipeline, and I think I cried like every day until because it was a lot. It
It's
was
a
a
lot.
lot for me.
Yeah.
And when I started this business, I had to stress test to see, okay, if
Mhm.
I really do write down my systems and processes, how much can I do?
Yeah.
And there was a point in 2020, thank God for everything being shut down, because I went into a dark hole of transaction coordinating. And at one point, I think I had 300 transactions with me and one assistant. I
Jeez.
do not recommend. I do not
That
recommend that
seems
to
insane.
anybody. I don't think I've ever been so stressed out in my life. 3 hours a night of sleep, 18 plus hour days. But it helped me like stress test and figure out like what the patterns were. So
Sure.
now a healthy range is about 60 to 80 with a team. A lot of companies, I'm sure people listening are like, oh, I'd love to get to be that big. But keep in mind that even if you want to close 5 to 10 a month, which is usually most people's goal,
Yeah.
um, you're looking at a pipeline of probably 20 to 30.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
think about that when you have someone managing that, or if you're the person that is managing it, because that's going to fall on your plate full time. And you're
Yeah.
going to neglect your pipeline when you get caught up in the problems that are
Yeah.
there. I'm off my
Yeah.
soapbox now.
No, 100%. And then, in terms of like working with a transaction coordinator, let's just say like, we talked a little bit about management and like, whether they hire someone or whether they outsource. But what about, you know, it's got to cross departments, right? It's got to hand off from, let's just say, an
Yep.
acquisitions rep to a transaction coordinator. And like, what needs to happen there to make sure that like that file or that contract makes it as smooth as possible to the closing table?
Yeah, that's a good point. Any operation, you have to figure out where one team ends and another begins. So you need to have a very clear handoff so that you can hold people accountable.
Hmm.
Mistake I see a lot of investors do is they want their acquisition guys to just go get the deal and not worry about anything else. You are not doing yourself any favors with this.
Hmm.
That person, like when you think about the person you send out to go get a deal, at the end of the day, they want to reassure the seller that they know what they're doing and that they should pick you to handle their problem over the million other investors that are calling them, right?
Hmm.
So you're going to sell a solution to them, but then you have to follow up with the customer service of it. So a big problem that we see are acquisitions teams that don't do proper handoff to us, meaning they don't give us all the information,
Hmm.
and they don't ask the right questions when they're with the seller. So
Hmm.
they don't even sign the contract with the right person sometimes. Like, I mean, it's wild. And then they're really annoyed with us. And we're like, well, we can't close this. And I'm like, what are you talking about? When am I getting paid? And you're like, you don't even have the right seller. Like, what do you mean? Well, they told me that they were, or that they're the heir, or they're the executor. And we're like, okay, well, there's rules for this. Just because you're an
Right.
executor of an estate doesn't mean that you're the rightful heir of the estate. And then that's a whole nother conversation. So my point is all of that to say that acquisitions teams need to be trained in how to ask the right basic questions when they're getting the deal signed. Not only does this help the transaction coordinator understand what to expect and to get on top of things before title even does, and that will reduce your close time and your risk, but it's also going to help build trust between the seller and your acquisitions and your team, right? We really do know what we're talking about. This is what you're going to like be required. And some sellers, and this is my own personal experience, I
Hmm.
did that right up front when I would go, and I did all acquisition appointments, by the way. So like I
Hmm.
would show, I contracted everything, and I would have them fill out a seller info sheet while I was there. I would have them sign an authorization. I would get the contract signed. I would walk them through the process, the timelines, everything. I would even go through the contract. Okay, I was that thorough.
Hmm.
But it was great because they knew I knew what I was talking about and they trusted that I was handling it. And then I've had some sellers that would be like, well, I didn't, so and so said they could do it without all this stuff. And I said, well, they don't really know what they're talking about. You are more than welcome to try it with them. And when it falls through, call me.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a lame tactic to say, I'm going to make this as easy as possible. Yes, you can make it as easy as possible, but communicate and be clear as to what that looks like. And
Yeah.
I think that that's a win-win for not only them, but for your team. So I'm in that kind of camp. And also, dispositioning, you mentioned you didn't really love dispoing deals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Whenever I went to go wholesale a deal, any buyer that knew that I was advertising a deal or that I picked up the phone to call, they knew my title was clean, they knew my paperwork was clean, and they knew that it was a good deal to buy from me because Casey does her due diligence, right?
Right.
Like we're transacting this correctly. So all in all, I just think it's a good practice to do that. And then your dispo team also needs this information, right? They're going
Hmm.
to need to know, is it clear? how long is it going to take to clear? Because when you're looking for a buyer, they're going to want to ask these questions. If this buyer
Right.
is using a lender and that's going to cause us a few extra days, is that going to cause us to lose the deal with the seller? So everybody has to have some baseline of knowledge of what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily need to be all the details. You just have to figure out what department needs to know what, where they need to go to get this information so that it's easily accessible, and then just training them to be able to communicate it in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I would say what we do is we don't just go in and take over the transacting. We
Mhm.
watch you guys, and if we feel like we're not getting the right info, I mean, I don't know if my team's come to you before and been like, "Hey, what's going on in acquisitions here?" Because we're missing some stuff. But we do it all the time, and we even give templates to our
Yeah.
clients here's an acquisition packet. Here's some really basic questions to ask. When you find out there's a deceased seller on title, here's the list of things you should ask for. If you know it's in foreclosure, here's a list of things to ask for, because you don't know if you're going to be able to get a hold of that seller in a timely manner again. So why not capitalize on that time that you do have their attention and just make the process that much tighter? So that's honestly, I'm a big advocate for that. I know a lot of people, I've gotten to tons of debates about this process with people. But I would say, again, the most successful clients I'm seeing and investors out there are the ones that are taking the time to train their acquisition guys properly on what it actually looks like, so that when a seller asks questions, they can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that I picked up from you guys is I just get an authorization signed. If there's a
Oh,
lien. I'd every
put that in your packet. Like, there's
Yeah, it's in
no
my
reason not to get that signed. And those also work in case there's liens. So the way ours is written is it works for anybody. It works for attorney. I mean, we had an attorney write that. And so, yeah, we can put it in the same authorization if we do find the lien, because a lot of sellers sometimes aren't aware of that. And so when we already have it on hand, we can get that faxed in immediately without having to go get a wet signature from a seller at 10 o'clock at night.
right.
Yes, you were saying.
Yeah.
Because when we're virtual, there's only so much we can do. So if you don't want to be running around with your head cut off, like,
Yeah.
let us train on what you can do up front and save you time.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, those are huge too, because then you can order, you guys can order the payoff on day one, right? And then we get the
Exactly.
closing a week earlier or whatever, instead of running around trying to get the seller to sign an authorization form to release the loan information.
And a quick note on the authorization forms. So I get this question all the time. People say, well, the title company is going to do that. You're right. They are going to do that 7 days later.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to send you an authorization sign unless they know they have a reason for it. So if it takes on average, I use the term 7 days because that's pretty much the average of what it takes to get title. Some places are quicker, some aren't. But around 7 days is what you're looking at. And I actually got into a debate with the title company. I will not name their name, but they are nationwide. And we got into a debate because they were frustrated that, well, we already do that. Why would you do that? And we need to know. And I said, because you're vetting the legality of insuring the policy.
Hmm.
We work for the investor, and the investor needs to underwrite their deal. They have to vet and make sure that the information that they were told is correct. So we are getting the payoffs for our clients, that they can look at those numbers right out the gate and know whether they can move forward or not. And he had this like light bulb in it, like moment, and he was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Well, what people don't realize is that title companies can't accept payoffs from you typically. I'm sure some do. But legally, it's a liability, because if they pay the wrong payoff, then they could be liable for the remainder of the funds, right?
Hmm.
So what we tell people to do is, hey, we're going to go ahead and order the payoff, but we're also going to have a copy faxed or emailed directly to the title company as well. And that's when you kind of make everyone happy. And he was like, well, that makes a lot more sense. A title company didn't even think about it. So again, it's just having someone in your court like that's going to be able to get you the information you need just to make sure you're not getting a bad deal.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about creative strategies. Are there any other, creative strategies that you've seen people using? We talked about sub two, we talked about novations. Those are the big ones, but is
Hmm.
there other stuff that people are doing right now?
That's a good question. That note refinancing was the most creative I've
Yeah.
seen. I mean, I was laughing so hard with them. I was like, this is actually interesting. I've never seen anyone do that. I would say the only other major thing I've seen is a lot of people working with mobile homes. Um, Mobile homes are something else. Like, I mean, that I've processed out mobile homes, and it was like the one process map that made me cry as well. Like I was just like,
Yeah.
there's so many, and it's so different for every state. But mobile homes are so creative because there's so many different scenarios. It's personal, it can be personal or real property. And then you
Hmm.
can go through a process of making it real property prior to closing. And there's a lot of different ways that you can work with them. So I have seen people get creative with that process. I would say I had one client who bought a mobile home in a park, like a mobile home park.
Huh. Okay.
And he would buy them because it's personal property at this point. It's not
Hmm.
attached to land, right? So he had to go through an attorney in Texas anyway. You have to go through attorneys for those.
Hmm.
And he would end up owner financing the mobile home to a new buyer. But because he was in a mobile home park, he still had to qualify for renting of the space. So it
Hmm.
was like a really
Interesting.
weird, it
Yeah.
was a very creative way to get money and process things quickly. But that was probably one of the more creative ones that I haven't seen a lot of people do because most of them are dealing with them attached or not attached to land,
Yeah.
or wanting to move them either or. So that he did quite a few of those actually, which was kind of interesting process to look for. We
Yeah.
were both learning along that way because these parks have different rules, right? Now we
Hmm.
had the added transactional piece of sending an application in, qualifying our client, even though he's going to own or finance it, and then he had to pass that again to the end buyer. So that was a fun one.
That's interesting. Yeah, we've never done any mobile homes that they don't own the land, but we got one on the market right now that we just flipped that you guys closed out for us and another in
Oh,
contract.
good.
So we love them. We love mobile homes on land. On land.
On land. Well, I have done. We've also had transactions. I've done this a bit in Colorado. I know a lot about mobile homes. If anyone else there wants to know, it was interesting because we with what they call I don't know if everyone uses the term, but purging to the land, like to purge it means to attach it. But it was interesting because it was attached to the land, but the records didn't show that it was attached to the land. So we
Mm,
learned how to go about doing that. And there's like three different departments in the county that you have to go through, and they all have to sign the same piece of paper. Like they have this one document that they have to look up records, verify, sign, pass it to the next person. And so I was on the phone for like an hour and a half with these. I'm like, who does it first? Like what is this process? It was so
right.
unclear. And so we had to kind of just do it by trial and error. And then after we did it, the title company goes, "Well, we'll do it for you for an extra fee." And I was like, I wish I knew that because I
Yeah.
would have paid.
I wouldn't-
But the client was already paying us anyway, so we figured it out. We saved him a little extra money, and it worked
Yep.
out in the end. So we documented that, and
Yep.
now we know when it comes again. So I feel like with mobile homes, there's so many moving parts, and knowing where to start is probably the biggest pain point. Because a simple thing like wanting to attach it to the land, you have to. A lot of people don't know. Well, is the land and the mobile home vested in the same owner?
Yeah.
We've run into situations where they're not.
Can you can you explain that actually for the people who may not understand that whole concept?
Yeah. So if we had a situation, I'll just give you a real time example where we had a client who wanted to buy a mobile home and the seller wanted to also sell the land. And so to make it worthwhile for my client, they said, "Well, we want it to be real property. We don't just want it to be a vehicle." So we said, "Well, would you like us to purge it to the land?" And they said, "Yes, we do want to go through that process prior to closing." So our
Mhm.
first question was to the seller legally, in order to do that through the county, you have to have the property, the land, and the mobile home in the same name. So the owner has to be the same name. In
Mm,
this case, they weren't because it was a
mm,
mother daughter. So I believe the mother owned the land and the daughter owned the mobile home. And so what we had to do was go get um, the statement of ownership from the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles. We had to get that from them. They had to transfer it over into the name
mm.
of the other, and then we had to go. Then we could prove that. Then we had to go through the process of combining both of the things, and then whatever the paperwork was that was involved in that.
What is actually, I don't even know what is the, because in Florida at least a lot, I think most of the ones we've done it has really been like a vehicle and the land. Um, but like what is the advantage of having them connected as one?
Well, the advantage is you get a title policy. You can't get a title policy on a mobile home if it's
Ah,
if it's
okay.
if it's personal property. So a
Okay.
vehicle's personal property. If it's not actual, real, tangible property, that's like by definition of what land is, then you can't get it insured the same. So it's just like a
Ah,
vehicle. Someone could just steal a vehicle. So the benefits of that is you can combine them, wrap them in, and now it becomes a title policy as a structure with the land.
interesting. Okay, I've done like 10 of these deals. I didn't know any of this. Like,
And some people want to keep them, as the vehicles. They just don't get title policy, which is why you can't through close to a title company. You have to go through an attorney because it's not actual real property that they can
ah,
insure the purchase of. And so it's not like you have a deed, to a mobile home. It's actually just a bill of sale, just like a
hmm,
car. So
okay.
it's kind of interesting. So if you are interested in mobile homes, you need to go. There's every whatever your Department of Motor Vehicle is, whatever you call it. There's if you search mobile home in there, there should be a whole department of how they do it. So some states have like they haven't really adapted. So Texas, we're 100% digital.
Hmm.
So everything went digital after a certain year. And so there's a whole lot of nuanced things you need to know about the process. And it's not that easy to figure out. I'm just going to say that from the hours I've involved. And every single state that we work with them in is a different process. So the first step is asking those questions to the seller. Do you like, is this attached? Is it not? If they don't know, a really easy way is to go to the county appraisal district
Hmm.
and the tax assessor and call them and ask, give them a parcel ID and ask how it's being taxed and at what amount and if it actually is considered. Um, and then that's how you'll know if well they went through the process, but maybe the county records might not reflect it because title company shows well I see the land but I don't have anything about the mobile home, and that's where you
Hmm.
see those disconnects. So sometimes it's just going to each department and figuring out what's what, and that's what a skilled TC could do for you.
Right. That's why I obviously don't know how it works, even though I've done 10 of them or
Exactly.
whatever. I don't know how 10 plus, right? In the last year or so.
That's so funny. I
Um,
don't love them. They are a headache for me, but
sorry.
they make good money for investors for
Yeah.
sure. Hey, it's okay. I'm not in the day to day anymore. My team can handle them.
Yeah. Cool. What else should investors like just consider on the transaction side when they're like putting a deal together with a seller? Like what are some things like I guess common mistakes that you see maybe newer investors make or even experienced ones?
Um, that's a good question. I feel like we covered a really good chunk of like my biggest ones that I see. I think definitely operationally, like making sure, because people say, oh, it's not their department, but making sure that everybody's involved in the process and has some kind of understanding of who's doing what and what their roles are super key. I would say another big thing that people just make a mistake on is not documenting it. I
Mm,
mean, there are so many things that can drop in a transaction. And you don't want to be scrambling at the last minute for things. So just having checklists in place, they can be very basic. But acquisition needs their checklist. TCs need their checklist for type of deal as well as market, because a lot of people go virtual and have different markets and they have different processes. So understanding that, and I would say a really good tip I have for you guys is if you're going through title resolution and solving problems, just write what you did. Just like make a quick note about it saying, so we've done that over the last 4 or 5 years,
mhm.
and now we've got like a resolving title Bible that we go by. Like, I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah.
it's UCC liens, mobile homes, like Medicaid, and you just go to that category, and then it's just what are the questions that you need to ask, what pieces of information do you need, and what's the process. Like just start by documenting it as you're dealing with it. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't have time. Trust me, the next time it comes up you don't have to go through the brain power of having to remember it.
Hmm.
And so even if you're on a big team and you have a TC who's in the weeds, I just recommend saying, tell them, make it a requirement that 1 hour every week they have to write a process out.
Yeah.
You won't regret it. It's going to save you so much time and energy. And I think the mental energy is really the biggest thing here. So that's a big mistake I see people make in their operations. And then they can't, when that person leaves or gets burned out, they can't replace them very easily. And now you're going through that whole process again of training somebody. And it's just, that's when people really throw in the towel and call us and like, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. Um, we've actually developed some training. The same thing, the same manual I train my team with, we're actually offering to TC. So if you do prefer in-house or if you want to have someone in-house, we do have something to train them on, which is how to not only the technical knowledge involved, but also operationally how to manage it, how
Mhm.
to think about processes, procedures, and policy, and how to, really create a standard for your business. I just think that this is one of the most overlooked positions known to man because your
Yep.
due diligence is this period. It's not underwriting your numbers. It's making sure that everything checks out and making sure that you've got the right insurance stuff in place. So I would say those are the biggest ones. And then the last one, which I've already mentioned and I'll say again, is knowing your strategies. You have to
Mhm.
know your exit before you know your acquisition. And then when you're selling these deals, if you are assigning these deals, make sure your buyer, I know it's not your responsibility fully, but make sure your buyers know what they're doing and what they're getting. I actually don't like working with people who assign sub twos to people who aren't flipping, or people that they don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me because now it's completely out of your control. Everything that you promised to safeguard
Yeah.
that seller for, you've got no say in. And you're like, well, it's not my problem. It's going to be your problem when
Mhm.
that person stops paying and, lawsuits start coming your way.
Yeah.
So just know what this stuff looks like and what's needed and make sure that the people that you're assigning these to know what they're doing and that you're not just passing off a deal to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice, especially with a sub two deal. I mean, you made a commitment, or your acquisition person did, to honor something, and you better be
Yeah,
careful the person you assign it to is, uphold that commitment if you're going to assign it. So
exactly. Yeah. I think that's all I got for that subject
yeah.
before I go into another rant.
Yeah, no, we're good. Well, we're kind of towards the end here, and there's always a couple questions that I like to ask towards the end. So one, and you can pick it from when you were in the investment side, or you can pick it from the transaction side. So I'll word it a little differently than I usually do. But what is the craziest or most uncomfortable situation that you've ever experienced in a
Oh,
transaction?
the amount of stories I have, I don't, that's like asking me to pick a favorite star, like in the heavens. Like, I don't even know. The craziest, I've had so many. You know what? I'll tell you the craziest story I've ever dealt
Okay.
with because it made me want to quit real estate altogether. This is when I was an investor. I was wholesaling deals. I was working foreclosures. I had this property that was on a VA loan that was actually in really good shape. It wasn't an old house. It needed a few things like carpet and stuff to meet the requirements for a lender. Um, Actually, the seller wasn't on a VA loan, the buyer was. I ended up listing the property. We
Mm,
had enough time. I stopped the foreclosure. I priced it right. I nailed that down. I got a buyer. He was a VA. For those of you that don't know, VA requirements are not as bad as FHA, but there's a few basics that you need to have, like having carpet or a working toilet, things like that. So I got this property done. The seller was a little crazy, which is not surprising because a lot of them are. And he had a pet pig in the backyard. And after grinding and like stopping this foreclosure, we missed six closings. Six closings. Six. Not because like everyone was good, whatever. And it was because he had to finish the repairs so that the appraiser could come back out and redo it. And this guy was like, I was over there every single day. I was like helping
yeah.
him roll carpet. I was like, what do you need to do? And he's like, I got this. And he was like, I'm breaking my back. And then he was like, would lie to me and I would go back and I would say, I was like, well, your pig is still here. Like, you still have a pig in the backyard. And then the buyer's agent would be like, Casey, the pig is still here. So
The pig
six
is still
closings. Six closings. And finally, the sixth time, I said, he told me it's not there anymore. He told me it's not there. Please go check. And he goes, Casey, the pig is here. We're done. We're canceling this. We lost the entire deal. Like,
Oh, it didn't go
and
through. Oh,
went to foreclosure. So I was like, after the amount of hours that I had spent on that deal and just the frustration, and it was really far from me. So that's when I was just like, I'm not going to list foreclosures anymore because that
yeah.
actually popped up in my memories the other day. And I was like, I can't. And that doesn't even sound like the craziest, but it's just a really memorable one to just point out that you can only control so much.
Yeah.
And, some of these people just bury their head in the sand. There's only so much you can do, but I've even had people fight over plants being removed from their yards. And refusing to sign because a plant was missing. I mean, it's just things that you can't make up.
Yeah,
Just can't make up.
the pig is still here.
The pig was that. I wonder what happened to that pig. I don't even know where the pig is.
Jeez.
Poor thing.
Um, cool. So the last question that I always have is, if you could go back in time to, when you were first getting into real estate and give yourself one piece of advice, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself?
Keep more properties.
It's
I
very
mean, you don't build wealth unless you own things.
good.
And you really start to leverage money and equity and things when you own things. And so especially with this market shift, I highly regret not keeping properties when they were 2, 3% interest, and taking that risk, or at least analyzing every deal I got through that lens. I wish
Mhm.
I had learned that first, because I think when you start wholesaling and assigning, you get really addicted to the cash flow.
Yeah.
um, you want those chunks, but marketing is so expensive and competitive, and you have to constantly be adapting to it. So what worked one year isn't going to work the next. And so I think I would have definitely wish I had gotten out of that rat race sooner. It would have been a less painful process, and I probably would have built wealth a lot quicker. I'm only just now starting, and so if after 6, 7 years in this industry, it's depressing. Like, I've made hundreds of thousands of dollars, but where does it go? It just kind of drains into marketing and things. So,
Yeah.
with that being said, I think that would have been something I would have told myself: is slow and steady wins the race.
Mm,
This whole concept of massive growth and scale is not what you think it is. There are stages to business, and
mhm.
I think a lot of people skip the stability piece, like finding that stability, before they grow. And then the market shifts, and they're like, whoa, did not account for this, because you're so busy and your head is, down, and you're working really hard and you're hustling. That's why I don't like this whole hustle culture, because when you're hustling like that, you're not being smart about assessing your risk and understanding what the larger factors are that are out of your control that could affect you, and being prepared for worst case scenario. So now that I've got rentals, I feel way calmer. I feel like I can not be desperate for deals. I can make better decisions. I can be super conservative and go at my own pace. And I've made far more money doing it this way than I did, you know, trying to scale and grow and get a huge pipeline.
Yep. I know exactly what you mean.
Everyone's like, I feel you.
Yeah. Cool. So if people, if they want to reach out to you, maybe if they have questions, or maybe they're interested in potentially talking about outsourcing their transaction coordination, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, so the best way, if you want some information, and we're about to launch a huge rebrand, by the way, which will be happening in the next month or so. But if you go to atlastcservices.com, in the top right corner, you can fill out just a couple questions to schedule a consultation call. And we'll send you a whole info deck, our pricing, kind of what we do. And I will personally get on the phone with you and kind of see where you're at, what you're doing, and see if we're a good fit for you. And trust me, we aren't for everybody. I'll be super blunt about that, and just kind of let you know. So if you'd like to get on the phone with me, that's the best way to do it. And then obviously follow me on Facebook. I know I have a very generic name, but my company has a Facebook page, but personally I do as well. So please add me, send me a message. If you don't send me a message, I won't see it and I won't add you because I am distracted. But I do post a lot of tips and tricks and things that we learn transacting hundreds and thousands of deals. We do like to post stuff, and you can learn a lot just from our personal experience. So that's a fun way to follow and participate too.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Casey, this was great. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks.